Hi, good evening, everyone. It's about 6:21, or sorry, 5:21 Central Time, 6:21 Eastern Time. So my office hour started about 5-6 minutes ago. I was just kind of waiting to see if anyone showed up. So far, no one, which is fine. What I'll do is, again, like last week, just kind of pick something to go over. We'll start out, excuse me, by taking a look at the Canvas course this week. Obviously, we're in Unit 3, and if you take a look at the Unit 3 module, you'll see that we're covering chapters 4 and 5 in the textbook this week. As you progress through the module, you'll see the two topics there that we're covering. Then the module's broken down even a little more. Got a couple of videos there to watch. There's topic 4. We're looking at creating and managing group policy, part 2. A couple more videos. Security templates, video there. And that's pretty much it as far as the Canvas content. Again, though, we're looking at chapters 4 and 5. So if we take a look at the textbook, chapter 4 is on configuring group policies, and chapter 5 is on managing group policies. So obviously we're totally focused on group policy for this week. And if you take a look at those chapters, you can see what all is covered there. And chapter 4 is kind of your first real, heavy introduction to group policy. And then chapter 5 gets into some of the nitty-gritty as far as managing it and talking about how group policy works, how it's processed, and doing different things with group policy results and stuff, managing GPOs. So obviously all of your labs are related to that this week. If we go back to our course, and we take a look at the assignment for this week, the Unit 3 lab assignment. And let's pull up the, let's just look at the lab guide with examples. And so you can see here we start out with chapter 4, activity 4.2. And so you'll be completing the assigned activities for chapter 4, and then after that the assigned activities for chapter 5. Remember, you can split up the chapters if you want to. Let's see, I believe there is one course, and out of all 3 courses that cover that focus specifically on Windows Server, there is one time where you have back-to-back chapters that you have to do both chapters in one sitting, but pretty sure this is not the one because it doesn't say so at the beginning of the lab. Let's look at the beginning of chapter 5 here. Yeah, so I think we're okay as far as that goes. But anyway, you can take a look at the first activity in each chapter. If it says to, if activity 5.1 says to reset the lab environment, then you know you're not using anything from the previous chapter. So that's one good indication that you can always just check that to be sure. So anyway, it's just those 2 chapters that you're doing the activities on, chapters 4 and 5. Again, I'm pretty certain those 2 are not linked, so you should be able to do chapter 4 in a separate reservation from chapter 5, or you can do them all at one time. But remember, you do always want to complete an entire chapter under a single reservation, though, because when you go back into NetLab under a different reservation, everything's been reset, so you don't you don't have all your previous work, and as you've learned already by now, one activity can build on a previous activity, so and be dependent upon it. So got to keep that in mind. Okay, so I think that's about all I wanted to talk about with Canvas. What I would like to do here now is just take a few minutes to show you a quick introduction to group policy video.
Welcome to the NT303 training course on group policy. Group policy is a powerful feature that allows the administrator to have a lot of control over the Windows systems that they support. This course is updated as required to meet the current exam objectives for the Microsoft certification exams. So, to start this course off, let's ask the question, what is group policy? Group policy allows the system administrator to have centralized control over users and computers on the network. Settings can be configured like desktop settings, printers, and login scripts, just to mention a few. Group policy works like this. An administrator, in this case, creates a group policy in Active Directory. They can then configure just over 3,500 settings. These settings can be targeted for users or computers. This includes desktop, laptops, and servers. Once the group policy is configured, it will be downloaded to the computer and applied. The administrator also has the option to configure group policy settings and assign them to specific users. Like with computers, the settings are configured and applied to the users. Any changes to group policy settings stored in Active Directory will automatically be downloaded to the computer and applied to the users and computers. You can see that the group policy feature in Windows allows the administrator to have a lot of control over the user's experience. Now that we understand what group policy is, I will now have a closer look at the history of group policy and how it works. Group policy was first introduced in Windows 2000. If you want to configure Windows, you can do this using the registry. However, changes made to the registry are permanent. In contrast, changes to group policy are not permanent and can be rolled back at any time. To remove a change, the administrator would simply unconfigure the group policy setting, and Windows will do the rest. The next consideration with using the registry is that the registry can change. This is common with new operating systems. If you control the user's experience using the registry, there is no guarantee that that same registry setting will work the same on a newer operating system. With group policy, changes in the operating system and new operating systems are supported. Although group policy is updated, in most cases the group policy will work the same on older operating systems and on newer operating systems. In some cases, you may need to configure some additional settings to support newer operating systems because they have new features. However, you should not have to change any existing settings. You can see the advantages of group policy over traditional registry editing to configure computers in your organization. With all this talk of centralized control, it may surprise you to hear that group policy is in fact client-driven. Group policy settings are configured on clients by client-side extensions, or CSEs. Which CSEs are installed on the clients depends on which operating system is running. Newer operating systems currently have 4 CSEs. All Windows versions that support group policies will have 3 CSEs. If the 4th CSE is not shipped with the operating system, Microsoft does have this CSE available to be downloaded and installed for operating systems after and including Windows XP. Group policy essentially works like this. Group policy settings are stored on a domain controller and replicated to all the other domain controllers. A client on the network will download a copy of the group policies that apply to that client. These group policies will then be processed by the client-side extension. If there is no client-side extension, or the client-side extension does not understand that setting, the setting will simply be ignored. This allows you to configure group policy without having to worry about older clients not being able to process that setting. Once you start learning about group policy, you will find that it is a flexible system allowing backward compatibility as well as future development. Well, that covers it for the introduction to group policy. Remember, this is only the first video.
Okay, so just to kind of stress something a little more than he did here in the video, the comparison between managing computers by changing registry settings versus group policy. You can imagine that if you were making changes via registry settings, it's obviously not as centralized a management method as group policy is, because from group policy you can do all of this from one location. You can just pull up the group policy management tool and make the configuration changes that you want to make. However, if you were doing these changes through the registry, you would either have to connect to each computer and make the changes to the registry on each computer, or you would have to create a script that would connect to each computer and make those changes. So as you can see, obviously the addition of group policy was very beneficial when it was released. Next, what I would like to do is take a quick look at another video here on understanding group policy management in Windows Server. And this is a little bit of an older video, but still applies.
Welcome back to another video. In this video for Objective 6.1, Creating and Managing Group Policy Objects, I want to talk to you a little bit about the GPMC, or the Group Policy Management Console. Before we do that, though, let's just take a look at Active Directory users and computers, because what I want to do is kind of show you the structure that we have here and explain it a little bit. So let me just go ahead and zoom in on that. So up here, we have our Kintoso.com container, and that's really our domain, right? That holds, it's the main object. And then you'll notice the next type of container is built in, and then right below it is computers. Now, these two containers here differ a little bit in appearance than this one right here. And that's because they're containers and they're not organizational units. So when we look at organizational units, which are these guys right here, depicted by the little square or whatever you call it on the folder, we can actually apply a group policy onto OUs, but we cannot actually apply group policy onto containers. And we have like foreign security principles, managed service accounts, users, computers, and built-in. Those are created for us when we create the domain. There's no way that you can actually apply a group policy to those containers. Now, I have created an OU structure of Kintoso, and then what I did was I created them by object type. So we have groups, servers, computers, all under the Kintoso OU. And we do this because we want to be able to apply group policy in a hierarchical fashion. Well, let's go over to the GPMC now. And we'll open that up kind of side by side. And we'll notice that we've got domains and then Kintoso. Let's move that over a little bit. And then underneath Kintoso, we have all of our OU structure, our domain controllers, and then our group policy objects. So let's just take a look at this for a second here. So we'll notice here we have the Kintoso.com domain container, and right underneath it we have a default domain policy. Now, this is actually what we call a link. This links to the group policy object down here, and this is actually our inventory of all the group policy objects that have been created. And this is actually the GP, the group policy object, and this right here is just a link to it. Now, down here we have domain controllers. And again, we have a link to it, to the default domain controllers policy out of the inventory of default domain controller policy, right? That rather group policy objects, and that's our default domain controller GPO. Now, if we take a look and we go and look side by side, we'll notice that the computers container is not in here. That's because you can't really do anything in group policy with a container. But we have our Kintoso.com container. We have our groups, or rather OU. We have our groups OU. We have our servers OU. We have our users OU. And then we have our domain controllers OU, and that's where our domain controllers actually sit. And we can see that the structure inside of Group Policy Management Console emulates what's in Active Directory, sans the actual containers or just basic folders that we can't do anything with. So now, let's go ahead and just take a look as to where these group policy objects actually are. And I'm just going to go down here and type in //kintoso.com, and we're actually looking at our domain controller right now. This is our sysvol. There's our kintoso.com container, or I guess folder. There is our policies, and we have two policies in here. Now, when the domain was created, these two policies actually got created. One is the default domain controller policy, and one is the default domain policy. And I'm just going to go into and edit the default domain policy. And if I go to the properties of this, we can see that the unique name or global unique ID is 31B2F. And there is our 31B2F. There is the actual GP for the default domain policy for Kintoso. And you'll notice that it's broken down into machine and user. And there's settings in here. We can't really directly edit them, but we can kind of peek in there and take a look at, what is actually configured and what the structure looks like. Now, generally, you don't manage anything from the sysvol. This is how all of your policies get replicated to all the domain controllers. But what I wanted to do is kind of show you the relevance of these folders in here. Now, going back, I'm just going to close that out. Going back here, if we open up, and I'm actually going to create a brand new GPO. We can do it in a number of different ways. When we create a GPO and link it, what we're actually doing is two steps. We're creating the GPO that's going to go into our group policy object inventory, and at the same time, we're linking it to the OU. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a brand new GPO, and I'm going to call this Kintoso Settings. And I'm going to OK it. You're going to notice that what happened in that step was our Kintoso Settings GPO got applied here, and that link also got created up here. I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to edit it. Now let's take a look at what we have here. Okay, so when we look at actually editing a GPO, we have our basic structure up here of computer settings or user settings. Now, depending on what type of object you're trying to policy, whether it's a computer object or a user object, you will isolate your settings to one of these different nodes, if you would. Because here's what's going to happen. If a user is under the OU and you set a whole bunch of computer configuration, it doesn't matter that the user is under that OU and this GPO is applied to that OU. If they're not set for the user in the user configuration, it's not going to apply to that object. So the first thing that we have to understand is that we have two different types of settings. We have computer configuration and user configuration. User configuration will not apply to computers, and computer configuration will not apply to users. Now, as we look at the structure in here, whether you're under users or computers, we have policies and we have preferences. Policies are what we originally got in Windows 2000, and every version since Windows 2000, they've improved it. This is how we actually policy users and computers. We have a couple different things. We have software settings. That allows us to apply software to remote computers or users, depending on where it's set. We have Windows settings. Those are like security settings, account settings. We have administrative templates, and these are where you actually get to control either the operating system or the user by setting, and we'll talk about the states, by setting the different template settings. Now, those policies are policied every 90 minutes in a process called background refresh. Background refresh is where the settings get reapplied to the computer, and not all of them, but 90% of them get reapplied to the computer. And this is how we policy a computer. Now, there's also preferences, and preferences are not really policied. They're more of suggested. When we log onto a computer or a computer starts up, they will be set, but they will not be background refreshed. They will only be done on the initial startup of the computer or the initial logon of the user. And this is why they're preferences. Why would we have preferences? Well, because lots of times we want to set the initial setting, but then allow the user to go ahead and set it. Now, I'll give you a perfect example. If we set the screensaver in a policy, that means that every time the computer starts up, or rather the user logs on, the timer for the screensaver will be 40 minutes. But let's say that you have people giving presentations where they might let the computer sit for 45 minutes. And you want to allow them to make it an hour, right? But if you make it an hour, you're going to affect everybody. Well, preferences, we can push down the preference of 45 minutes and thus allowing them to set it to whatever they want. Whereas if we set it through a policy, one, every 90 minutes it would be refreshed and brought back to 45 minutes. And two, we would actually lock the user out because lots of times it grays out the setting. So this is kind of, group policy. We're going to look a lot more at it as we go through the objective. Hope you gained something out of this video. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Like my videos, share my videos, enjoy my videos. If you have any comments, leave them down in the comments section below. Google+, Facebook.
Okay, so good description there of the difference between policies and preferences, and how those function differently. Let's see. Okay, so going back to the course, again, don't forget, looking at the assignments here for the week, or I'm in the wrong course, sorry, looking at the assignments for the week, don't forget that you have your lab assignment. Of course, you have the weekly discussion that you have every week, and then in this course we also have the knowledge check each week. So don't forget about your knowledge check for Unit 3. Make sure that you knock that out. Of course, these quizzes, you've probably already figured this out. Hopefully you have. These quizzes are based on your assigned reading each week. So, each of you has to kind of figure out what works best for you. I know some students will read the chapter, then do the knowledge check, then go back and do the activities. Some students will do the activities as they're reading the chapter, and then later on do the knowledge check. I mean, you just have to figure out what works for you, but don't forget about the knowledge check. Make sure you get that done each week. And we've still had nobody join for the office hour, so no questions to deal with or anything. So at this point, we'll go ahead and cut it off, and I'll get the video posted up to the class here shortly.